October 16th, 1972. A twin-engine Cessna 310 was boarded with House Majority Leader Thomas Boggs, House of Representatives member Nicholas Joseph Begich, Begich's political aide Russell Brown, and pilot Don Johns in Anchorage, Alaska. It departed Anchorage 1 minute before 9 a.m. en route to Juneau for a political fundraiser for Begich's upcoming congressional race, but neither the plane nor any of these men would ever be seen again. The following 39-day search for the plane and the men who occupied it would turn up nothing, and the men would be declared dead on December 29th, 1972.
Thomas Hale Boggs Sr. was born in Long Beach, Mississippi on February 15, 1914. He attended Tulane University in New Orleans, where he earned a bachelor's in journalism in 1934, and he earned a law degree in 1937. Boggs was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives as a Democrat in 1941 for Louisiana's 2nd District, as at the time the youngest elected member of Congress. After serving in the House for only one term, he joined the United States Navy in 1943 after losing his bid for renomination to his predecessor, Paul Maloney. He served as an ensign for the remainder of World War II.
After his return from military service, he was re-elected to Congress after Maloney retired, and he was then re-elected 13 times after that. In 1951, Boggs ran a campaign for Louisiana governor, which came to an abrupt end when his membership in the American Student Union in the 1930s was brought to light by another candidate by the name Lucille May Grace. At this time in the 1950s, the American Student Union was thought to be a communist front, which ultimately led to the demise of his run for governor, but somehow not his career in Congress.
Boggs ended up being the House Majority Whip from 1962 to 1971, which essentially meant that he would go to all the party members and just ensure that they were backing on all the certain bills and making sure that everybody was voting the same way. He also would end up becoming the House Majority Leader from 1971 until his death. Also during his time in Congress, he was affiliated with some pretty infamous bills, such as the Southern Manifesto, which was a pro-segregation bill that opposed racial integration. Also during his time in Congress, he was affiliated with some pretty infamous bills, such as the Southern Manifesto. Quit it back there!
What?
I see you. During his time in Congress, he was affiliated with some pretty infamous bills, such as the Southern Manifesto, which was a pro-segregation bill that opposed racial integration in public places. He also voted against the civil rights bills of 1957, 1960, and 1964, but he changed his tune in 1965 and 1968 and voted in favor of those civil rights bills. He was also notably the youngest member of the Warren Commission, which spanned from 1963 to 1964 and investigated the assassination of John F. Kennedy. According to the Office of the House Historian and Clerk of the House Office of Art and Archives, during the commission, Boggs was a pretty staunch opponent of the single bullet theory, which is essentially what the mainstream idea of what happened to JFK is that Lee Harvey Oswald was the only shooter and he's who killed him. His opinion would miraculously change 2 years later, though, when he made a television appearance essentially stating that he had no doubt that Lee Harvey Oswald was the only shooter and that nobody should question the Warren Commission. It's also worth noting that Lee Harvey Oswald was born in New Orleans and was living in New Orleans in 1963 when JFK was killed, which, as we said earlier, is where Boggs was representing. So, pretty interesting. The district attorney of New Orleans at the time, Jim Garrison, also stated in a book that was published in 2007 that Boggs had convinced him to reopen the investigation into the assassination of JFK in 1967, 3 years after the Warren Commission had ended. Towards the end of his life, he spent a lot of time attacking the FBI because he believed that they were tracking him and surveilling him and were violating his rights. He noted that many members of Congress also believed that he was being tracked by the FBI, but they didn't want to make public statements. I don't know why. And it ultimately led to the then President Richard Nixon kind of refusing to take advice from him because he thought that he was crazy, and he even requested that Boggs be replaced. So this was in April of 1971. This brings us to the next person of interest, Nick Begich.
Nicholas Joseph Begich Sr. was born on April 6, 1932 in Eveleth, Minnesota. Begich had received a Master of Arts from the University of Minnesota, but attended many other schools, such as St. Cloud State University, University of Colorado Boulder, and the University of North Dakota. Begich moved to Alaska after college, where he worked as a guidance counselor in the schools in Anchorage. In 1962, he was elected to the Alaska Senate, where he served for 8 years. In 1968, he ran for the only United States House seat that Alaska had at the time, but lost to the incumbent Howard Pollock. In 1970, however, Pollock ran for Alaskan governor, which led to Begich running for Congress again and winning. He was running for re-election in 1972 when, while accompanied by Boggs, his plane went missing over Alaska.
The pilot of the plane, Don Johns, was said to have been a man of remarkable character. From the one article I read online, he not only owned the Cessna Twin that he was flying that day, but he also owned the small charter company that he had called Pan Alaska Airways. He was also reportedly providing the flight for free just because of the stature of the people who were on board. 10 minutes after the Cessna had lifted off from Anchorage, Johns radioed the FAA in Anchorage to file his flight plan. He was planning on flying a VFR, which means visual flight rules. I am not a pilot, so I am not super familiar with what that means. But from everything I could read online, he was more than capable of doing that, and he was a very accomplished pilot.
During the call to the FAA, Johns was asked if he had emergency supplies and an emergency locator transmitter on board, as it was Alaskan state law for the plane to have such a device in case of a crash. Johns answered affirmative, but it was later determined after the disappearance that there was no emergency locator transmitter or survival gear on the plane. This call to the FAA that ended at 9:09 a.m., just 10 minutes after they took off, was the last time that anyone would hear from them because somehow the recording of the call between Johns and the FAA in Anchorage has gone missing. What the freak?
The search for the missing plane started almost immediately because soon after the plane failed to land in Juneau, authorities initiated a search. They started by calling other airports and FAA stations, but no one had heard from them. And after 30 minutes of calling around to other airports and FAA stations, authorities turned to contacting an already airborne Air Force C-130 to look for the missing Cessna, which it proceeded to do without success. But in the days that followed, search efforts would ramp up, leading to a 39-day search of the area that included countless boats, planes, and even an SR-71, which is just a cool plane. And in the final report from the NTSB, they concluded that there wasn't enough evidence to say definitively what had caused the plane to disappear.
Although the NTSB has no official cause for the crash, there are a few theories. One theory, and probably the most likely, is that the weather may have caused them to crash. The route that Johns had selected took them through a place called Portage Pass, which was an almost mile-wide, low-altitude valley that was almost 6 miles long. The pass was surrounded by peaks of up to 4,000 feet that could have created a vortex that took the plane down. Portage Pass was a pretty difficult place to search for the rescuers, but they did search it. It's entirely possible, though, that the plane is somewhere in Portage Pass, hidden under the dense forest canopy where the searchers were not able to find it.
Or it was a bomb.
This theory is one that was brought into the limelight pretty recently by journalist John Walzak from iHeartMedia, with evidence coming out just really over the past several years. An anonymous letter clipped together with newspaper clippings was sent to Begich's wife in November. The plane went missing in October, so in November, the letter went to Begich's wife, and it said that he was murdered by a Yugoslavian-affiliated organization because he was Croatian, and at the time, Croatia and Yugoslavia had pretty severe political tensions because Croatia wanted to be separated from the socialist state of Yugoslavia. There's a fun fact. I'm going to tell you a fun fact really quick.
We start from
Many of these terrorist attacks carried out by the Croatian separatists occurred in 1972, and a lot of them were pretty... You might have heard of some of them.
Ever heard of 9/11?
No. There's one... I don't remember like the flight number or anything, but you might have heard the story of the flight attendant falling out of the plane from 33,000 feet and surviving. Have you heard of this story?
No.
You haven't?
Maybe.
Vesna Vulovic?
You just said you didn't remember the flight number or anything.
No, the flight number. That's the lady's name.
You should have just
She fell out of the plane out of 33,000 feet and survived. But that was a Croatian terrorist attack on the plane. There was a bomb. There was a bomb in the plane, okay? We'll get to that later. This is foreshadowing. One thing that doesn't really make sense about the letter is that while the letter itself was stitched together with newspaper clippings to make it totally anonymous, the envelope that it was mailed in was handwritten from Detroit. So I guess the argument could be made that the person maybe wrote the letter, let's just say in Yugoslavia, and then said, hey, friend in Detroit, can you mail this for me? But the person from Detroit never said, my Yugoslavian friend told me to mail this for me, because the FBI did end up investigating this, so I don't know. I don't think there's much volition to that. In the FBI's investigation of the letter, they found fingerprints on the envelope, which led to nothing. They ended up launching investigations in like 8 different cities, which also led to nothing. But there's a pretty interesting note that in the 1990s, a low-level mob figure was serving a life sentence in Tucson, like a Tucson prison, and he told investigators that he was involved in a plot to blow up the plane. It's also worth noting that just over a year after the flight went missing, the inmate, whose name was Jerry Paisley, ended up marrying Peggy Begich, which is Nick Begich's widow, which is a little weird, but the marriage only lasted a year, and there's no real evidence that links him to the disappearance or anything, so I don't think there's much volition to it. Without recovering the actual plane, it's pretty much impossible for us to really know what happened to the flight. I think that the connection of Nick Begich to the whole like Croatian terrorism. I think that the connection of Nick Begich to the Croatian terrorism thing is a bit of a stretch, because it seems to me like his parents grew up there and they were ethnically Croatian, but there's no real evidence to link him to terrorism or anything. But I mean, it is entirely possible that bad weather took them down. It is entirely possible that weather just took the plane down. I mean, it is Alaska, and it's a lot of mountains and stuff. They could have very easily just crashed. But one thing I didn't say earlier is that just past Portage Pass, there's a small town called Whittier, and residents of that town reported hearing a small plane flying over right at the time that they were scheduled to be flying over that town. So seemingly they made it through Portage Pass and towards Juneau, but I don't know. Whether or not that plane was actually them that they heard is, I don't know, up to speculation. If I were to put my tinfoil hat on and make a guess as to what happened, I mean, this is super conspiracy territory here, but I think that the FBI maybe, allegedly, potentially had something to do with it. I think that the connections of Boggs to the Warren Commission and all that, and him talking about the FBI spying on him, is way too suspicious not to look into. I also think it's really interesting that while the FBI was investigating the disappearance, they focused only on Begich, as if to like pull the attention away from Boggs, even though I think he really is the main person of interest here, not Begich, who's just a House of Representatives member. I think potentially a bomb could have gone off in the plane somewhere between Whittier and Hinchbrook Island, as we see in the map right here. A couple more interesting notes about this case that don't really fit in anywhere, I just thought they were interesting to add, is that since they went missing in October and the elections were held that November and they weren't declared dead until December, both Begich and Boggs ended up winning their elections and were both sworn in while they were missing, and then declared dead after they were technically elected to office. So they were both special elections for both of their positions. The man who ended up taking Begich's House seat was a man named Don Young, who would end up serving on that position from 1973 when he was elected all the way until March of 2022, which is just really crazy to think, because when you first read the story, it's like, oh, that was so long ago. With this guy who was essentially a product of this like occurrence, died 3 years ago. Nick Begich's grandson, Nick Begich III, was just elected to the House of Representatives in Alaska this past election. So, pretty crazy. Thanks for watching. This is the first video on the new channel. And I don't know, low-key might have done really freaking bad, but that's okay. I researched this in a day, so I probably missed a lot, but I heard this story on a podcast and I thought it was too freaking interesting not to talk about. So yeah.
Freaking frogs gay.